There are some stories in the world of music that feel larger than life, almost mythological. They're tales of incredible talent, meteoric rises to fame, and the kind of success most people can only dream of. But sometimes behind the gold records and the sold-out arenas lies a story that is profoundly, achingly human. A story of loss, of pain, and of a darkness that can threaten to extinguish even the brightest of lights. This is one of those stories. We're going to talk about a man whose hands crafted the soundtrack for a generation. A man whose guitar didn't just play notes, it screamed, it cried, and it sang with a fiery, untamed spirit. He was Larkin Allen Collins Jr., a founding member and lead guitarist of the legendary Southern rock band, Lynyrd Skynyrd. His name is forever etched into the DNA of rock and roll, most famously as the architect of the transcendent, immortal guitar solo in Free Bird. But the story of Allen Collins is so much more than a single iconic moment in music history. It's a Greek tragedy played out on the stage of 1970s America, a harrowing journey through unimaginable triumphs and equally unimaginable sorrows. It's a story about what happens when the music stops, when the cheers fade, and all that's left is the deafening silence of a life shattered by fate, again and again. So, settle in, because this isn't just about the glory. This is about the cost of that glory and the haunting, unforgettable saga of Allen Collins. To truly grasp the essence of Allen Collins and the music he created, you have to transport yourself back to the place and time that forged him, Jacksonville, Florida, in the 1960s. This wasn't the sun-drenched, tourist-filled Florida you might see on a postcard. This was the working-class, gritty, swampy side of the state, a place where the air was thick with humidity and the cultural currents ran deep. The American South during this era was a crucible of change and tension. It was the tail end of the Jim Crow era, the height of the civil rights movement, and a landscape steeped in tradition, pride, and a fierce sense of identity. And out of this soil grew a unique musical ecosystem. The raw, emotional honesty of the blues, the storytelling tradition of country music, and the rebellious energy of the British invasion rock bands, like the Rolling Stones and the Yardbirds, all converged here. This was the primordial soup from which Southern rock would emerge, and young men like Allen Collins were right in the middle of it. Allen, born in 1952, was not a product of privilege. He grew up in a blue-collar neighborhood on the west side of Jacksonville, a place known as Shantytown. Life was tough, and for many kids like him, music wasn't just a hobby. It was an escape. It was a way to channel the frustrations, the hopes, and the raw energy of their lives into something loud and powerful. Allen got his first guitars as a young boy, and the connection was immediate and profound. He wasn't a student of formal theory. He was a student of feel. He would spend countless hours in his room, listening to records and painstakingly teaching himself to play by ear. His mother, Eva, later recalled how he'd play until his fingers bled, a testament to a dedication that bordered on obsession. He was chasing a sound, a feeling, something that could express the inexpressible. His early influences were the titans of the electric guitar, figures like Jeff Beck, Eric Clapton, and Duane Allman. But he wasn't interested in simply copying them. He was absorbing their language to find his own voice. It was in this environment that a group of ambitious, long-haired kids found each other. The story of Lynyrd Skynyrd's formation is itself a piece of local folklore. Allen Collins, riding his bicycle, happened upon Ronnie Van Zant, who had just hit a baseball into the yard of another young guitarist, Gary Rossington. A jam session ensued and a spark was lit. Along with bassist Leon Wilkeson and keyboardist Billy Powell, they formed the core of a band that was hungry, determined, and fiercely loyal to one another. Their early days were a relentless grind. They practiced for hours on end in a sweltering, unair-conditioned shack on a friend's property they nicknamed the Hell House. It was here, in this suffocating heat, that they forged their sound, a three-guitar assault that was dense, intricate, and utterly unique. They weren't just a band. They were a gang, a brotherhood, bound together by a shared dream and a relentless work ethic. This context is crucial. Lynyrd Skynyrd's music wasn't an act, it was an authentic reflection of who they were and where they came from, proud, defiant, and deeply rooted in the culture of the American South. Allen Collins wasn't just playing Southern rock, he was living it. The journey from the Hell House to international stardom was a long and arduous one, paved with countless gigs in rough-and-tumble bars and clubs across the South. For years, Lynyrd Skynyrd was the hardest-working band nobody had ever heard of, but their talent and tenacity were undeniable. It was during this period that Allen Collins truly came into his own as a musician and a songwriter. He wasn't the band's frontman, that was the domain of the charismatic and commanding Ronnie Van Zant, but he was one of its primary creative engines. Alongside Ronnie and Gary Rossington, he was the architect of the band's musical identity. His guitar style was a study in contrasts. It could be blisteringly fast and aggressive, a torrent of notes that sounded like they were about to spin out of control, but it could also be melodic and soulful, capable of conveying deep emotion with just a few carefully chosen bends. He favored the Gibson Firebird and later the Explorer, guitars that matched his stage presence, lean, angular, and explosive. On stage he was a dervish, a blur of motion with his long blonde hair flying as he prowled the stage, seemingly lost in the music. His interplay with Gary Rossington became a hallmark of the Skynyrd sound. They weren't competing, they were conversing, weaving intricate guitar lines around each other to create a sound that was far greater than the sum of its parts. The band's big break came in 1972 when they were discovered by the legendary musician and producer Al Kooper. He signed them to his Sounds of the South label, an imprint of MCA Records, and in 1973 they released their debut album, pronounced Lynyrd Skynyrd. The album was a revelation. It was a bold statement of intent, a perfect encapsulation of their sound and ethos. And on it were songs that would become rock and roll cornerstones. Allen Collins's fingerprints were all over it. He co-wrote the classic Gimme 3 Steps, a rollicking barroom anthem based on a real-life encounter Ronnie Van Zant had. But his crowning achievement on that first album, and arguably his entire career, was Free Bird. The story of Free Bird is itself a piece of Skynyrd lore. The opening chords were something Allen had been working on for years, a beautiful melancholic progression that he couldn't seem to find a home for. Ronnie Van Zant was initially skeptical, feeling it had too many chords to write lyrics over. But one day, he had a breakthrough, and the song began to take shape as a mournful ballad. It was Gary Rossington who came up with the idea for the iconic slide guitar parts in the intro, inspired by his hero, Duane Allman. The song was already powerful, but it was missing its climax. The band decided it needed an extended outro for their live shows, a showcase for their instrumental prowess. And it was here that Allen Collins stepped into immortality. The second half of Free Bird is his masterpiece. It's a masterclass in building tension and release, a relentless, exhilarating climb that just keeps building and building. It's not just a guitar solo, it's an epic journey, a declaration of freedom and defiance that perfectly captured the spirit of the band and their audience. The success of their debut album propelled Lynyrd Skynyrd into the stratosphere. They followed it up with a string of classic albums, Second Helping, 1974, which featured their biggest hit, Sweet Home Alabama, Nothing Fancy, 1975, Gimme Back My Bullets, 1976, and the live album One More from the Road, 1976, which captured their raw, explosive energy as a live act. Throughout this golden era, Allen Collins remained a vital creative force. He co-wrote many of the band's most beloved songs, including That Smell, a cautionary tale about the dangers of rock and roll excess, and the poignant The Ballad of Curtis Lowe. His guitar work continued to evolve, becoming more sophisticated and dynamic with each album. The addition of a third guitarist, Steve Gaines, in 1976 only added to the band's sonic firepower, creating a truly formidable three-guitar attack. Life on the road was a whirlwind of sold-out shows, adoring fans, and the temptations that came with being one of the biggest rock bands in the world. But beneath the surface, the pressure was immense. The band lived as hard as they played, and stories of their wild antics became the stuff of legend. For Allen, who was by all accounts a more sensitive and introspective soul than his wild stage persona might suggest, the constant chaos was both exhilarating and draining. He was married to his high school sweetheart, Kathy Johns, and they started a family. The pull between his life at home and his life on the road was a constant source of tension. Yet the music remained the focus. In 1977, they released Street Survivors, an album that many critics and fans consider to be their finest work. It was a mature, powerful statement from a band at the absolute peak of their creative powers. The album cover famously depicted the band engulfed in flames, a piece of imagery that would soon take on a chilling, prophetic significance. 3 days after the album was released, their world came crashing down. On October 20th, 1977, the chartered Convair CV-240 airplane carrying Lynyrd Skynyrd between shows in Greenville, South Carolina and Baton Rouge, Louisiana, ran out of fuel. The pilots attempted an emergency landing in a heavily wooded area near Gillsburg, Mississippi, but the plane clipped the tops of the trees and slammed into the ground, tearing apart on impact. The crash was catastrophic. It claimed the lives of Ronnie Van Zant, Steve Gaines, his sister and backing vocalist Cassie Gaines, assistant road manager Dean Kilpatrick, and both pilots. The rest of the band and crew were left with horrific, life-altering injuries. The scene of the crash was one of utter devastation. Allen Collins was among the most severely injured of the survivors. He suffered 2 fractured vertebrae in his neck and severe damage to his right arm. The initial prognosis was grim. Doctors told him that his arm was so badly mangled that it would likely need to be amputated. For a guitarist of his caliber, whose entire life revolved around his ability to play, this was a fate almost worse than death. In a rare interview years later, he recounted the harrowing moments of the crash, the sound of metal tearing, and the terrifying silence that followed. He spoke of the immense guilt of survival, the profound and inescapable grief of losing his friends, his brothers in arms, in such a brutal and sudden way. The crash didn't just end the golden era of Lynyrd Skynyrd, it shattered the lives of everyone involved. Allen spent months in the hospital, undergoing multiple surgeries and grueling physical therapy. Through sheer force of will, he managed to save his arm, but the damage was permanent. The nerves were severely compromised, and he would never regain the full dexterity and strength he once had. The physical scars were obvious, but the psychological wounds ran far deeper. He was haunted by the crash, by the loss of his friends, and by the abrupt and violent end to the dream they had all worked so hard to build. The vibrant, fiery guitarist who had once seemed invincible on stage was now a broken man, grappling with a pain that was both physical and existential. In the aftermath of the crash, The surviving members of Lynyrd Skynyrd retreated from the public eye, each trying to piece their shattered lives back together in their own way. For Alan Collins, the path forward was fraught with difficulty. The music that had been his salvation was now a painful reminder of everything he had lost. For a time, he couldn't even bear to pick up a guitar. The silence was a stark contrast to the thunderous roar of the life he had known. But the creative fire, though dimmed, was not extinguished. By the late 1970s, he began to slowly find his way back to music, reuniting with fellow Skynyrd survivors, Gary Rossington, Billy Powell, and Leon Wilkeson. They initially formed a new band, simply called the Rossington Collins Band, as a way to heal and to continue making music together. They made a conscious decision not to be a continuation of Lynyrd Skynyrd. They brought in a female lead singer, Dale Krantz, to create a distinct identity and to avoid any comparisons to the irreplaceable Ronnie Van Zant. The music they created was still rooted in Southern rock, but it had a different flavor, more polished with a touch of blues and AOR rock. Their debut album, Anytime, Anyplace, Anywhere, released in 1980, was a commercial success, going gold and producing the hit single, Don't Misunderstand Me. For a brief moment, it seemed like Alan had found a way to move forward, to build something new from the ashes of the past. He was playing guitar again, writing songs, and back on the road. But tragedy was not finished with him yet. In 1980, during the tour for the Rossington Collins Band's debut album, Alan received devastating news. His wife, Kathy, who was pregnant with their third child, suffered a massive hemorrhage and died suddenly. This loss was, in many ways, even more profound and personal than the plane crash. Kathy had been his rock, his anchor since his teenage years. She was the one who had been there before the fame, the one who had held their family together through the chaos of his rock and roll life. Her death sent him into a spiral of despair from which he would never fully recover. The grief was all-consuming. He turned to alcohol and drugs, not for recreation but for obliteration. He was trying to numb a pain that was simply too immense to bear. His bandmates watched, helpless, as he descended further into addiction. His behavior became increasingly erratic and unreliable. The Rossington Collins Band managed to release one more album, This Is the Way, in 1981, but the magic was gone. The internal tensions, fueled by Alan's escalating substance abuse and the lingering trauma that haunted them all, became too much to overcome. The band dissolved in 1982. Alan attempted to start another project, the Alan Collins Band, but his heart wasn't in it. His personal demons were now in complete control. He was a man adrift, haunted by the ghosts of his past and drowning in a sea of grief and addiction. One can only imagine the crushing weight he carried, the survivor's guilt from the crash, now compounded by the devastating loss of his wife. It was a burden that would prove to be insurmountable. The final, and perhaps most cruel chapter of Alan Collins's tragic story began on January 29, 1986. Alan, heavily intoxicated, got behind the wheel of his new Ford Thunderbird with his girlfriend, Deborah Jean Watts, in the passenger seat. He lost control of the car near his home in Jacksonville, and it flipped over into a ditch. Deborah was killed instantly. Alan was pulled from the wreckage alive, but his injuries were catastrophic. The crash had severed his spinal cord, leaving him permanently paralyzed from the waist down. The irony was devastating. A man who had survived one of the most infamous plane crashes in music history had his life irrevocably altered by a car accident he himself had caused. The legal consequences followed. He was charged with DUI manslaughter. He pleaded no contest, and as part of his plea deal, he agreed to use his fame and his story to warn others about the dangers of drunk driving. But the true sentence was the one he would live with every day for the rest of his life. He was confined to a wheelchair, robbed of his mobility, and in the ultimate twist of fate for a guitar god, he would never be able to play his instrument again. The hands that had crafted the soaring solo of Freebird were now stilled forever. This was the nadir, the absolute bottom of a life that had already been defined by an almost unbelievable string of tragedies. He had lost his band, his best friends, his wife, and now his girlfriend, his freedom of movement, and the very thing that had defined his existence, his ability to make music. It's a level of suffering that is difficult to comprehend. The physical pain of his paralysis was immense, but it paled in comparison to the emotional and psychological torment. He was trapped not only in his own body, but also in a prison of regret, forever haunted by the knowledge that his actions had led to the death of someone he loved. In 1987, the surviving members of Lynyrd Skynyrd decided to reunite for a tribute tour, with Ronnie Van Zant's younger brother Johnny taking over as lead vocalist. For many, the idea of Skynyrd without Ronnie, Steve, and Cassie was controversial. But for the survivors, it was a way to honor their fallen brothers and to bring the music back to the fans. Despite being unable to play, Allen Collins was determined to be a part of it. He took on the role of musical director, helping to plan the set lists and arrangements. And in what became the most poignant and powerful moment of every show, he would be wheeled out onto the stage. He wouldn't play a note. Instead, he would speak to the audience. With a voice weakened by his condition but filled with a raw, painful honesty, he would tell his story. He spoke about the crash, about the losses he had endured, but most pointedly, he spoke about the night of his car accident. He didn't make excuses. He didn't shy away from his responsibility. He told the thousands of fans in attendance about the devastating consequences of drinking and driving. He laid his soul bare, transforming his personal tragedy into a stark, unforgettable cautionary tale. Imagine the courage it took to face those crowds every night, to relive his darkest moments, not for applause, but in the hope that his story might save someone else from making the same fatal mistake. It was a form of penance, a final act of a man trying to find some semblance of meaning and redemption in a life that had been so thoroughly ravaged by tragedy. These appearances were deeply moving but also incredibly difficult for him. His health was in a steady decline. The paralysis led to a host of complications, and he was in constant pain. The years of substance abuse had also taken a severe toll on his body. He developed chronic pneumonia, and as his lungs weakened, his condition worsened. On January 23, 1990, Allen Collins passed away at the age of 37. It was a quiet, somber end for a man whose life had been anything but. The legacy of Allen Collins is complex and multifaceted. First and foremost, there is the music. His contributions to Lynyrd Skynyrd are immeasurable. He was a truly gifted and innovative guitarist whose style has influenced countless musicians. His songwriting helped to define the very genre of Southern rock. The solos he crafted are not just technical exercises. They are emotional statements, moments of pure, unadulterated rock and roll transcendence that will live on as long as people listen to music. When you listen to the interplay between him, Rossington, and Gaines, you are hearing a band at the height of its powers, a musical brotherhood creating something timeless. So, how do we remember Allen Collins? Do we remember the rock god, the blonde-haired whirlwind of energy on stage, unleashing one of the most iconic guitar solos in history? Or do we remember the tragic figure, a man seemingly cursed by fate, whose life became a catalog of unimaginable loss? The truth is, we must remember him as both. To separate the triumph from the tragedy would be to misunderstand the man and his story. His life was a symphony of light and shadow, of soaring highs and crushing lows. We're done for today. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this helpful, smash the like button, comment below, and hit subscribe for more great content coming your way soon.